Legend of Total War here, and today we're doing another Legendary Lord power comparison video where we take all the Legendary Lords from a particular race and compare them to one another and give them a rating out of 10 based on their strengths and weaknesses based on 3 particular criteria. How good their battle power is in how much damage that they can do in battle, whether that be in melee or in magic. Their commanding power, as in how much they're able to boost their soldiers in battle, and faction power, as in how much they're able to provide globally to their faction passively on the campaign map. So, last one we did was the Greenskin Legendary Lord comparison, and I used a pretty high threshold for their criteria, where 5 out of 10 was the benchmark if they provided nothing. And based on feedback from that video, I've decided to adjust that criteria a little bit, so that we get a little bit more of an accurate feed on basically the difference between a top Legendary Lord and a bottom one. So now if a Legendary Lord provides nothing in that particular category, they'll now be given a 3 out of 10. What this will do is give a much greater reading difference between a top Legendary Lord and like a bottom one. So if we were to compare that retroactively to the Greenskin one, we'd probably see Grimgor Ironhide get a 5 out of 10 instead of 7, whereas we'd still see Wurza get a 9 out of 10. Okay, with that being said, now let's jump into the number 5 spot for the Dark Elves, and we're just going to do this in ascending order, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we'll work our way through there. So coming in at number 5 is Malus Darkblade. And I don't think this entry is going to surprise many people because Malus Darkblade is pretty well known for not being a very good Dark Elf Legendary Lord. But where he is quite strong is his battle power, which I'm going to give him a 10 out of 10 in regard to that, because he is arguably one of the best melee fighters in the game, largely thanks to being able to summon Zarkan. So looking at his skill tree, at all things that makes him particularly strong, we firstly have to look at the Warp Sword of Cain. If you manage to get access to this, being able to restore 8 hit points per second and 5% damage resistance while in melee, that is a significant amount of regeneration, especially considering that Malus Darkblade has essentially 2 pools of health. Because once you get low on health with Malus, you can summon Zarkan, which you can do sometimes when playing as Hag Grief, but any time when playing as any other faction that's just confederated him. So Malus Darkblade is actually more valuable confederated into somebody else's faction than he is in his own faction, because his own sort of abilities actually hinder Hag Grief a little bit. But anyway, the Warp Sword of Cain, really good weapon. Now, Spite, his mount, is actually terrible. It actually weakens him because it makes him a bigger entity, meaning it's easier for other people to shoot him. It does make him a little bit faster, but it doesn't make him particularly fast. It makes it a lot worth it. And it makes it so that melee units, more of them can hit him at any given time, and it doesn't actually increase his melee attack and melee defense. So Spite actually makes Malus Darkblade weaker in combat and doesn't provide enough bonuses to make up for that. So I would advise people not putting him on Spite. And then there's, of course, Zarkan himself. When he does summon Zarkan, Zarkan has a number of abilities that he can keep summoning as long as he's alive. And the great thing about summoning Zarkan is that if you do it, and regardless of whether you win or lose, as long as your army doesn't get wiped out, if you summon Zarkan, Malus Darkblade will not be wounded at the end of that battle. He'll only have like 1 hit point left, but he won't be wounded. So it's kind of okay to do it, even if he's going to get wounded. It's just that if he does get wounded, you take a morale hit for the entire battle. So it's a bit tricky with that kind of stuff. So he's going to get a 10 out of 10 in terms of battle power because he is extremely strong. Can't deny that. Now, in terms of commanding ability, he's going to get a 4 out of 10. So 3 out of 10 being the baseline now, he provides a very small amount of bonus for his army. Now, the units that he boosts are Cold One Knights, Cold One Dread Knights, and Cold One Chariot units. Now, this doesn't include Scourge Runner Chariots, which are actually a really good unit. But the units that I just mentioned there, they're actually some of the worst units in the Dark Elf roster. They're slow, they have low entity numbers compared to other cavalry units, and they're just not great fighters. And they're, generally speaking, overpriced. Get them in the late campaign. There's just better units to use that'll do more damage, that have greater effect, that are easier to use. Some people might like them and it's totally fine to get them, but on legendary difficulty, I highly advise avoiding recruiting these units. And so with him boosting these units, and basically these units alone, that doesn't really provide any points. However, he does have a skill over here that will reduce the upkeep cost of all of the units in his army, regardless of what they are, by 10%. And whilst the Dark Elves are so rich that that probably wouldn't matter that much, 10% still better than nothing, and so he's going to get basically 1 point for that. So 4 out of 10 for commanding ability. In terms of faction ability, Malus Darkblade is going to get a solid 3 out of 10, because he provides nothing. There is nothing he does faction-wide that provides any bonus to any Dark Elf faction, regardless of whether he's in his own faction or confederated into somebody else. He doesn't do anything. So overall, Malus Darkblade is going to get a 5.6 out of 10, making him one of the worst legendary lords in the game. He's a good melee fighter, but that's about it. It's not really good enough, and that's why he's getting the number 5 spot. Coming in at number 4 is Crona Hellebron. I kind of expected Crona Hellebron to score a little bit higher than she did, but upon evaluating a lot of her abilities, I realized a lot of them actually have no value. But she still is quite good. It's just in different ways than I expected. So she's getting the number 4 spot, and let's firstly evaluate her battle power. So she's going to get a 9 out of 10 in that regard, because obviously she's not as good of a killer as Malus Darkblade, but she does have some really good abilities, especially the Death Sword and Cursed Blade. Basically, this turns her into kind of like a Mortis engine, where she goes into melee. She doesn't even need to inflict any damage, but just goes into melee and causes damage to combatants in a 30-meter radius, and then she's able to pull out of combat for 10 seconds and then go back into it and then apply it again. Or apply the same ability constantly to like a bunch of different units in like a line, depending on how you want to use it. So this ability here gives her the potential to inflict hundreds of casualties upon enemy infantry units. So it's very useful. She's a really good infantry killer, despite the fact she doesn't really have any magic. She does also have 2 reasonably good sort of mid-tier mounts, the Cauldron of Blood and Manticore. You could go either way. Personally, I prefer her to be on the Manticore, because that will complement the Death Sword and Curse Blade a lot more, because you'll be able to push her through combatants a lot easier, because it's a faster mount, allowing you to apply the Cursed Blade to more units at a time, if you wanted to do that. She also does have regeneration, which is of course very valuable, and she's just overall a very good fighter. But she's not a duelist, so probably avoid fighting other lords that have higher stats than her, which there are a reasonable number of them. But overall, 9 out of 10 is a pretty solid score. Now, in terms of her commanding power, she's going to get a 6 out of 10. She does have a pretty significant upkeep reduction for Witch Elves, Sisters of Slaughter, and Harganeth Executioners. Now, these are not the best units in the Dark Elf roster, but they are sort of pretty good. Sisters of Slaughter are probably the best among them, and she's able to boost their stats by quite a bit as well, with bonus versus infantry and extra melee defense. So those units in her army can be quite valuable, but those are not the best units that the Dark Elf has to offer, so she's not going to get full score for that. She does also have this pretty good ability here, Gaze of Cain, which basically makes all of the units in that 30-meter radius berserk, giving them extra melee attack and leadership, so it really does complement the sort of units that you would see in her army. So 6 out of 10, pretty solid score, not super high. Now, in terms of faction power, she's only going to get a 4 out of 10, because she really doesn't provide that much at all. She provides more than Malus Darkblade, but this is it. She just provides 2 loyalty to new recruits, that's about it. She does have some local bonuses, but I don't really value local bonuses anywhere near as high as faction-wide bonuses. So if we have a look here, the loyalty to +2 to new recruits, that's basically all she does, so she's only going to get a 4 out of 10 for that. So her overall score is going to be 6.3 out of 10, so only a little bit higher than Malus Darkblade. Coming in at number 3 is Lockheer Fellheart. Now, before doing this evaluation, I kind of expected Lockheer to get the number 4 spot, but upon looking at his skill tree, I realized there's actually quite a lot of value in Lockheer. So, firstly, evaluating his battle skill, he's going to get a 9 out of 10. Now, it's a different 9 out of 10 than what Hellebron got, because they're 2 different melee combatants. Both of them are, of course, melee lords, but Lockheer is a duelist, so he's better at taking out enemy lords and heroes, whereas Hellebron is better at inflicting mass casualties onto enemy infantry. So Hellebron will end up getting more kills usually, but those kills will be lower value than Lockheer, whereas Lockheer isn't really quite so good at dealing with mass infantry. So looking at all the things that make him strong, he's got the Helm of the Kraken, which provides him with a bit of regen, but only while in melee. He's got a Dragon Mount, which is of course a lot better than a Manticore or a Cauldron of Blood mount. And he's got a lot of abilities in here that'll allow him to just basically be a better melee fighter. So Lockheer Fellheart would probably beat Hellebron in a duel, but would not outkill her in a straight up battle. So that's why he's getting a 9 out of 10. And in terms of Malus Darkblade, he'd probably beat them both at the same time. So in terms of command ability, Lockheer is going to get a 5 out of 10. He doesn't provide much bonuses. He basically just boosts Black Ark Corsairs. Now, Black Ark Corsairs are great, and they'll do well up until about the mid-game, until about turn 60, but at that point, even with reduced upkeep cost and increased leadership and melee attack, you're probably going to want to phase out these units because they just don't fare well in the late game. They're just too early game units. But in the early game, they're pretty good. But I can't really give him too many points just for that. So he's going to get a 5 out of 10 for that. He does also reduce upkeep cost by 5% for all units in his army. So he'll get a little bit of extra bonus for that as well. Now, in terms of faction power, this is where Lockheer Fellheart really does give a lot of a boost to the faction. Much more than I originally thought. So just listing all the things that he provides +4 Lord Recruit ranks, +1 loyalty to new recruits, +5 growth for Black Arcs, and +5% income from ports, giving him an 8 out of 10 when it comes down to faction power. So he is actually quite valuable to Confederate, as any other Dark Elf faction. So just looking at that, there's Lord Recruit rank, loyalty, over here, Black Arc growth, income from ports, and Lord Recruit rank over there. So all of that's quite valuable. So overall, Lockheer Fellheart is going to get a 7.3 out of 10, making him pretty valuable, but falling very short of the number 1 and number 2 slots. Coming in at number 2 is Marathi. So I think Marathi might actually be one of the most underrated lords in the game, and I think that's largely due to her start position being quite difficult. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean she's not good. She's extremely valuable, and I'll go into detail why that is. So in terms of her battle power, I'm going to give her 10 out of 10. Now, most wizards in this game are going to get essentially a 10 out of 10 because magic is just super valuable. Just about every single law of magic in this game can be utilized to inflict massive damage on an enemy army and therefore be highly valuable. There is a couple of exceptions though. For example, Malagor might not get a 10 out of 10 because he does have one of the worst laws of magic. He's not a good melee combatant and he doesn't have a mount, so he might not get a 10 out of 10 for that, but I'm not evaluating him today. I just want to put a baseline down to why all these spellcasters get such a high score, because spellcasting is so valuable. Now, upon that note, looking at Marathi's skill tree, one of the things that's both good and bad about her is that she's just got so many skills. She's got her unique skills, she's got a unique magic tree, she's got 3 laws of magic to draw on, she's got tons of abilities and equipment. Basically, the biggest problem with Marathi is just that there's so much there, it's impossible to get everything that's good within the 39 skill points that you'll get to assign her. So she'll never actually reach her full potential, which isn't a bad thing, but it also is a little bit annoying. So that might be where some people might rate her a little bit lower. But regardless of pretty much which way you level her up, as long as you don't put it all into the blue line, she will be extremely powerful. So the 3 laws of magic that she gets access to is Death, Shadow, and Dark Magic. The only really notable spells are Pit of Shades and Soul Stealer. I wouldn't really bother using these spells very much at all. But these are 2 of the best spells in the game. One from the Law of Shadows, one from the Law of Death. And Marathi's equipment is able to reduce the cooldown time and the cost on a lot of these spells, along with providing her with bound spells and extra Winds of Magic reserves. There's so much in here that if I was to go through it all, I think it'll just take too long. So I really just want to basically say she got a lot of stuff in here and then just move on, Don't go through everything. Trust me, there's a lot there. Anyway, the next thing that I want to evaluate her is on her commanding power, which again, she's going to get a 10 out of 10 because she is a really good commander. Now, in terms of her trait, that's not particularly useful, but her skill here, which I would recommend going down the Insidious line instead of the Tenacious line because it is mutually exclusive. If you go down to favorite assets, you can get a extra 10 melee attack and melee defense for Shades, and Dark Riders, Doomfire Warlocks, and Scourge Runner Chariots, but I'm specifically looking at Shades because Shades are probably the best unit the Dark Elves have. So the fact that she's the only legendary lord that boosts Shades, apart from, you know, the generic tree, which I'm not going to evaluate that on because everyone's got that. The fact that she boosts those units, that's extremely highly valuable. And another thing that's going to value her as a commander is the ability to debuff the enemy units by so much just by being close to them. The Heartrender and Dark Sword reduces the enemy melee attack and melee defense by 9 just for being close to her. And she's got Enchanting Beauty, which will also reduce it by an additional 9. So adding that up, minus 18 melee attack without even having to cast a spell, without even having to debuff them, just by being close to them, is a huge bonus to her commanding ability. It makes all of her units that much more effective. Well, I guess I should say, makes the enemy units so much less effective. Oh, by the way, she's also got regeneration, so that's on top of the commanding ability stuff. So basically, every single Dark Elf Legendary Lord is able to regenerate in some way or form. And she's also got Sulafet, which is a really good mount for a spellcaster, because when spellcasters want fast mounts, so that's another thing back on her battle ability. Marathi has a very, very meaty skill tree. There's a lot in here. So yes, in terms of her commanding ability, she's going to get a 10 out of 10, because there's a lot that she can boost her units. So I highly advise giving her a Shade Doom stack, because she can boost it by so much. It's not like Shades are supposed to go into melee, but they are decent melee combatants, and when they run out of ammo, they may need to. And sometimes you're not going to get a choice. Sometimes the cavalry is just going to get at you, and having extra melee defense is going to help. Anyway, in terms of faction buffs, she gets an 8 out of 10. So she was pretty close to 10 out of 10, but not quite there. She gives a small boost of Winds of Magic, faction-wide, plus 8, which is still better than Knowledgeable, but you can still get plenty of Knowledgeable Lords throughout the heroes throughout the campaign, so it's not that big of a deal. And she provides plus 2 ranks for Assassins and plus 5 extra campaign movement range for all characters. So that's in Insidious at Endless Scheming there. So there's the plus 2 ranks for Canine Assassins. There's also Hero Success Chance plus 5% all characters. Really good if you're doing some assassinations. And the plus 5 campaign range, campaign movement range faction wide, that is, you know, that's valuable. You know, if you're ever playing whack-a-mole with someone, being able to catch up to them where otherwise you wouldn't have, it's better than nothing. But yeah, it's not as many bonuses as, say, the number 1 guy is going to get, which we all knew who was going to come at number 1. But overall, Marathi is going to get a 9.3 out of 10, making her actually one of the best legendary lords in the game, and one of the most confusing legendary lords to evaluate because her skill tree is just so damn big. But anyway, that's the end of this one. Let's move on now to number 1. Taking the number 1 spot goes to Darth Mummy's boy himself, the Witch King Malekith. So Malekith this is a bit of an interesting scenario here, because he's actually sharing the number 1 spot with Marathi, because Marathi and Malekith are both taking the number 1 and number 2 spot because they are tied in terms of score. Malekith is going to get a 9.3 out of 10. Now, previously in live streams, I've mentioned that Malekith is probably a 10 out of 10, but now that I've gone through a detailed analysis, I can't justify giving him a 10 out of 10. He's going to get 9.3, which is the same as Marathi, but he's getting different scores in different areas, and that's what we're going to go through now. So in terms of battle ability, of course, Malekith is going to get a 10 out of 10. He's a spellcaster lord, he gets a dragon, he's very good in melee, of course he's going to get 10 out of 10. He's not quite as good of a spellcaster as Marathi, and he only really has the Lore of Dark. He's not an amazing spellcaster with that stuff, but when you take into the fact he is an amazing melee fighter, he does have Seraphon, which is a dragon, he'll beat the crap out of any other spellcaster lord in the game, no problem, in addition to just, generally speaking, beating the crap out of most other, even non-spellcaster lords in the game. So yeah, 10 out of 10 for him in regard to battle ability. Now, where he falls a little bit short is with his commanding ability. I looked pretty hard to find anything that can give him the 10 out of 10 score here, but I can't give it to him. I can only give him 8 out of 10. Most of his skills here provide faction-wide abilities or abilities to his combat. They don't provide bonuses to his army. The only thing that provides bonuses to his army is this here. Reduced upkeep for Blackguard of Nagaron, Dread Spears, Bleak Swords, and Dark Shards by 50%. Now that is really good, and that's where he's going to get the 8 out of 10, but these are not the best units in the Dark Elf roster. These are late game units with the Blackguard of Nagaron, but units that I would never spam, and early game units. So he's really, really good in the early game, but late game when you're phasing some of those units out and going for shades, that bonus will be lost. Because while reducing upkeep cost is really good, the Dark Elves kind of don't really have an issue with money. So reducing upkeep cost kind of becomes irrelevant when you've got 15 armies sort of thing. So that bonus sort of becomes pretty outdated really quickly in the late campaign. So that's why he's only getting 8 out of 10. Can't justify giving him a 10 out of 10, especially when comparing it to Marathi. And there's nothing he really does to boost his army at all. It doesn't have any special abilities or anything to debuff the enemy, apart from, just his regular sort of magic. Anyway, where Malekith really shines is his faction power. He's of course going to get a 10 out of 10. What he does, if you go through the Tyrant line, which is what I would highly recommend, you could go down either one, but I would personally recommend Tyrant. Public Order +1 all provinces, very useful. Tax rate +5%. And this one here is what you really, really want to get. This is his best ability and is essential for Dark Elf economy. Income from slaves, 20%. Slave decline rate, -10%. That's probably the best one for him. You are able now, with the addition of Masters, to reduce the slave decline rate to 100% in the regions that you want to put slaves in, meaning that you can keep that income super high for the entirety of the campaign, as long as you're not constantly making access of Dark Conduit, because that'll really use up your slaves. And also the slave public order penalty decline, -15%. I'd say that if you're playing on Legendary difficulty, that is essential. And even though War Leader reduces upkeep cost by 10% for all armies, I would say that that ability there would save you less money than what this here would make you. So this would make up for the 10% extra upkeep penalty. Of course, it largely depends on how you play. If your economy is trash and you're going with an overbloated military, well then that would be better. But I would always advise, taking care of your economy. There's no reason not to do that. And then these abilities over here, while they wouldn't be added onto his faction ability because it doesn't provide faction-wide buffs, these are just, this is probably one of the best local province abilities in the game, allowing him to get a really good start in the early campaign as long as you do it correctly. Gross 25, tax rate +30%, construction cost and construction time reductions will allow Malekith with any province that he's in to develop very quickly, but he's not going to scored on that. It's really these two abilities here that's going to provide all of him with his 10 out of 10 faction ability. So overall, Malekith is going to get a 9.3 out of 10. Now, even though Malekith has the same score as Marathi, I'm still going to just say, yeah, he is kind of number one because I value faction power more than command power, and I value commanding power more than battle power sometimes. So it depends on what way you want to value it, but that's what I would. Essentially, they're both the same, but in different ways, Anyway, that's the Legendary Lord skill comparisons and power comparison. Let me know what you think. This one was a little bit more difficult to compare than I expected, just because I did not expect Malekith and Marathi to get the same score. I actually looked pretty damn hard to find anything I could find just so they could get a slightly different score. I don't care if Marathi ended up being the best Dark Elf Legendary Lord, but in evaluating them, I have to admit they are both valued the same at 9.3. Anyway, that's the Legendary Lord skill comparison. Let me know what you thought, and also let me know which one you want me to do next in the comments below. And I appreciate you, and I'll see you next time, fuckers. Don't forget to sub.